The peaceful dismantling of the Soviet Union, the triumph of liberal democracy, and other lies we've told ourselves over the years since 1991. We haven't gotten to Fukuyama yet, although we certainly will, but we have started exploring and poking holes in the narrative of the so-called peaceful death of the USSR. We looked at the civil war that erupted in Tajikistan in an earlier pair of episodes, and we've started looking at the situation in Georgia under Soviet rule, leading up to the events of the late 80s and early 90s. I'm your host David, and today we are going to continue that Georgian story by looking at the events surrounding Georgian independence and the civil war that broke out, largely along ethnic divisions, resulting in thousands of deaths and the displacement of as many as 300,000 people. This is the post-Cold War. In our first video on the Georgian Civil War, we shone a spotlight on the three autonomous regions that were situated within the Georgian SSR: Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and Adjara. In that video, we showed how historic imperialism in the Caucasus, as well as the USSR's Korenizatsiya policy, inflamed ethnic tensions within the Soviet Republic. We then finished by alluding to the explosive effects of Gorbachev's glasnost policy. Indeed, while for decades the Soviet system had largely kept a lid on serious unrest, by the late 1980s, Soviet citizens' newfound ability to voice their grievances had encouraged increasingly radical rhetoric from all sides. But Georgia was not entirely unique for its Matryoshka system of autonomous Soviet republics and autonomous oblasts. They existed across the Soviet Union. But ethnic tensions were one thing, but all-out war was another. So, how did Georgia move from one to the other? Well, as we explored in our previous video looking at Georgia, for decades the nationalist movement there had largely been led by intellectuals and public figures whose aims were limited by the realities of the Soviet framework in which they operated. These aims included, among others, constitutional protections for the Georgian language, which were achieved in the 1970s. Following Georgian reactions to Khrushchev's de-Stalinization drive following the secret speech in 1956, Moscow had also afforded the Georgian SSR a position of relative privilege and autonomy, which the Georgians defended with notable success during Soviet rule. By 1987, however, the first opposition groups started openly appearing. Among them were the Ilya Chachavadze Society, founded by former dissidents, and the Helsinki Union, founded by Zviad Gamsakhurdia and Merab Kostava. At this point, however, these groups were primarily interested in the preservation of Georgian culture and were not yet overtly political. Yet. By 1988, though, the situation was desperate. Gorbachev's perestroika policy was quickly destroying the USSR's macroeconomic stability, and calls for full independence from the Soviet system were intensifying. It was in this context that tens or even hundreds of thousands of protesters found themselves outside the House of Government in Tbilisi on April 9, 1989. The protests, which originally started in response to a declaration made by 30,000 Abkhazians requesting their separation from Georgia, had by then been going on for around 5 days. The authorities had until now exercised restraint, but on April 9th, they attacked protesters with toxic gas and sharpened shovels, resulting in the deaths of at least 20 people. Another 200 were left seriously injured. Responsibility for the violence remains controversial and not entirely clear. However, former Soviet Foreign Minister and then Georgian President Eduard Shevardnadze later commented, quote, "Whatever decisions or military methods may have been taken by the local state organs, without the sanction of the Ministry of Defense, they could not have been implemented. Therefore, it is unjustified to blame only the local leadership for what happened." The immediate effects of the authorities' overreach, however, were obvious. As Jonathan Wheatley argues, 9th of April 1989, quote, "was a defining moment in the history of modern Georgia, and henceforth became a recurrent theme in Georgian nationalist discourse. Nationalism was to define political life in Georgia during the dying days of the Soviet Union, and after this violent event, its discourse was characterized both by a refusal to compromise and, amongst certain circles, by increasing intolerance towards non-Georgians. In the long run, the seeds of conflict that were sown in the early morning of April 9, 1989, would prevent the opposition from achieving any unity of purpose and would also ensure the failure of Georgia's first non-communist government." In short, the 1989 April tragedy in Tbilisi radicalized the opposition and made compromise with the Soviet government impossible. Public opinion had shifted equally dramatically. 5 months after the massacre, an opinion poll found that 89% of all Georgians supported full independence, a higher percentage than even Estonia at the time. Separatist militias also emerged at a dramatic rate, the most notable of which was the Mikhailovna, led by a former bank robber and master of the Soviet shadow economy, Jaba Ioseliani. Other figures, the most important of which was undoubtedly the aforementioned Zviad Gamsakhurdia, also started promoting more radical, ultra-nationalist positions. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the first major split between the opposition concerned one of Georgia's autonomous regions, South Ossetia. In November 1988, unrest had broken out in Ossetia regarding a draft law which outlined that teaching in all of the Georgian SSR's schools would be conducted in the Georgian language, and that acceptance into institutions of higher education would hinge on a test on Georgian literature and language. The proposal was ratified into law in August 1989, and in response, on November 10th, the Ossetians submitted an attempt to achieve full autonomous republic status with a view to uniting with neighboring North Ossetia in the Russian SFSR. Gamsakhurdia took the initiative, and on November 23rd, he organized a march of Georgians from Tbilisi to the South Ossetian capital, Tskhinvali, in support of local Georgians. Another opposition leader, Georgi Chanturia, condemned Gamsakhurdia's actions and supported a more moderate position. But the two ultimately joined forces to help form the Round Table Free Georgia bloc, which won the first democratic elections to Georgia's Supreme Soviet in October and November 1990 with a majority of 54%. Still, Chanturia and other more moderate opposition figures were increasingly uncomfortable with Gamsakhurdia and his radicalism. Low-level skirmishes between Georgians and South Ossetians had continued in the lead-up to the elections. Shortly before, in September 1990, South Ossetia had declared itself a fully independent republic within the USSR. Georgia's Supreme Soviet annulled this in December, however, prompting all-out war. Ossetians and Georgians both committed acts of ethnic cleansing against each other in the early weeks, and in one particular incident on December 12th, several Georgians were killed in Tskhinvali. The government declared a state of emergency and sent in police and paramilitary groups such as the Mikhailovna. In early 1991, Gamsakhurdia declared that, quote, "The Ossetians must leave. This is plain. There is no other way out." And on February 1st, 1991, Georgia disconnected the electricity supply to South Ossetia. Meanwhile, Gamsakhurdia had started building a power base around himself. He convinced Parliament to make him executive president and later convinced another leading government figure, Tengiz Kitovani, to establish the National Guard to reduce the unchallenged influence of Ioseliani's Mekhedroni. Gamsakhurdia would quickly turn on Ioseliani and the Mekhedroni completely. The paramilitary group had established significant political and economic power through organized crime rings, and this stood in the way of Gamsakhurdia's ambitions. In February 1991, Gamsakhurdia thus used a detachment of Russian tanks to attack the militia just outside of Tbilisi and arrest key members. This included Ioseliani, who would remain in prison until December. Soon after, in April, Georgia declared itself independent, and the Supreme Soviet again voted to expand Gamsakhurdia's powers. By the time Georgia's first presidential elections were held in May 1991, Gamsakhurdia won 86% of the vote. Gamsakhurdia would not last long as the first president of independent Georgia, however. Through his erratic behavior and uncompromising approach certainly hastened his downfall, the August coup of 1991 in Moscow saw swathes of his former supporters turn on him. Under pressure from the plotters, Gamsakhurdia made the decision to subordinate Georgia's newly formed National Guard to the Soviet Ministry of Internal Affairs, which contradicted both his own rhetoric and Georgia's independence declaration. In response, Georgia's National Democratic Party organized anti-government protests in September, which in turn descended into chaos as opposition militias clashed with each other in the streets. Tbilisi became, in effect, an active war zone. The chaos continued until December 1991, when Kitovani's National Guard, which by now had also turned on Gamsakhurdia, entered Tbilisi to quell the unrest and free Ioseliani, which they achieved on December 26th. With Ioseliani out of jail and the Mekhedroni Unleashed once again, Gamsakhurdia's former allies demanded his resignation and ousted him in a coup on January 6, 1992. Gamsakhurdia and his supporters fled first to Armenia and then found themselves in exile in Chechnya, leaving Georgia in the hands of warlords. As summarized by Wheatley, under Gamsakhurdia, quote, "The Georgian state, while nominally independent, was barely viable. It had lost its monopoly over the use of force. Government forces were little more than another militia. Moreover, Georgia had lost most of South Ossetia as a result of Gamsakhurdia's inflexibility and refusal to negotiate." After Gamsakhurdia's fall, the men who led the coup against him, Kitovani Iosliani and another man named Tengiz Sigua, set up an interim government called the Military Council. They reinstated Georgia's 1921 constitution, which supported both free and fair elections and democracy. Rather than elect a leader, however, they initially opted to invite none other than Eduard Shevardnadze to return to Georgia to assume the role of de jure head of state. Shevardnadze obliged in March 1992, and his role as head of state was legislated in elections later that year. One of Shevardnadze's earliest moves was to attempt to reverse the actions of his predecessor in South Ossetia, where the situation had deteriorated dramatically. Fighting had intensified, and in one notable incident on May 20th, a group of Ossetian refugees came under fire. This resulted in 36 deaths and retaliatory attacks against Georgians. Shortly after, on June 24th, Shevardnadze met with Russian President Boris Yeltsin, South Ossetian leader Torez Kulumbegov, and North Ossetian leader Askarbek Galazov in Dagomis near Sochi to agree a ceasefire. The agreement was as follows. Hostilities were to end on June 28th, and within 3 days, all military arrangements were to be withdrawn to form a demilitarized zone. A joint group of Georgian, Russian, and Ossetian peacekeepers was to be established with its headquarters in Skinvali, and there would be no resumption of hostilities, no sanctions, and refugees from both sides would be able to return to their homes freely. The terms of the agreement were, of course, quickly violated, and hostilities did not actually end until July 13th. In total, the conflict between Georgia and South Ossetia resulted in 1,000 deaths and left a further 3,500 with injuries. This is to say nothing of the thousands of both Georgian and Ossetian refugees who were displaced from their homes. In the background, or perhaps the foreground, actually of these developments, the specter of Gamsakhurdia continued to haunt Georgia. His supporters, known as Sviatists, continued an insurgency against the Shevardnadze government throughout 1992 and 1993, and even managed to seize Tbilisi's state television center in June 1992. Mingrelia, the region of Georgia from which Gamsakhurdia hailed, became a haven for Gamsakhurdia's supporters and prevented Shevardnadze from establishing control despite the efforts of the Mekhitrioni on several occasions. It's also worth providing a quick word on Adjara here. Gamsakhurdia had hoped to abolish Adjara's autonomous status, an idea which Adjarians in their regional Supreme Soviet were not particularly keen on. In March 1991, however, Gamsakhurdia somehow convinced, or more likely bribed, its members to elect Aslan Abashidze, whom he trusted to fulfill his ambitions. When Gamsakhurdia was overthrown in January 1992, Abashidze unilaterally decided to establish an administrative border and barred both supporters of the new government and Sviatists from entering the region. He also created his own party, the Union for the Revival of Adjara, which he then used to pursue his own authoritarian agenda. Shevardnadze effectively just ignored this and allowed Abashidze to do what he wanted, judging that he could at least trust him to keep Adjara stable. Notwithstanding Shevardnadze's early moves to end the conflict in South Ossetia with some success, what the cases of Mingrelia and Adjara tell us is that Shevardnadze was, for all intents and purposes, extremely weak. Indeed, he was ultimately a puppet leader appointed by the more powerful warlords who backed him, namely Kitovani and Iosliani. Now, you may have noticed that we haven't mentioned Abkhazia at all yet, and this is because it was here that the weakness of Shevardnadze became vital for what came next. So, in August 1992, shortly after the ceasefire in South Ossetia was signed, a group of Sviatists in Mingrelia seized a portion of the railway track that linked Tbilisi to Moscow, and also took several high-ranking Georgian officials hostage in Gali, a majority Georgian region of Abkhazia. In response, Shevardnadze instructed Kitovani to take his National Guard into Abkhazia to clear the railway track and free the hostages from the Sviatists. Sounds simple, right? Well, not really, because Shevardnadze did not have much, if any, real authority over the military council. Kitovani made the unilateral decision to not only retake the rail line, but also head towards Sukhumi, the capital of Abkhazia. On August 13th, Kitovani's National Guard thus entered Abkhazia, and on August 15th, Yosliani's Mekhedrioni got involved as well when it made a naval landing near the port of Gagra. The Abkhaz National Guard met the Georgian troops with fierce resistance, but by August 18th, the Georgians had reached the parliament buildings in Sukhumi. This forced Abkhaz leader Vladislav Ardzingba to temporarily relocate the Abkhaz government to Gudauta in the north. You may be surprised to hear, however, that until this point, relations between the two sides had actually been relatively stable, or at the very least, a war only of words and laws rather than one of blood. Indeed, in August 1991, Gamsakhurdia had signed a power-sharing agreement with Ardzingba in which the new 65-seat Abkhazian parliament was created, with seats demarcated by ethnicity. For sure, there was low-level skirmishes between Abkhazians and Georgians, both prior to and after this agreement, but it was nevertheless significant. So, why did Kitovani head towards Sukhumi? Well, in part, it was simply because he could, but perhaps more so because on July 23, 1992, Abkhazia reinstated its 1925 constitution, which declared that Abkhazia had the right to secede from Georgia at any time. This was undoubtedly a direct response to the military council's decision to restore Georgia's constitution earlier that year. In effect, the Abkhaz leadership spotted a window of opportunity amidst the chaos in Georgia to assert their own claims to sovereignty, and Tbilisi had to respond. With the Mekhedrioni's entry into Abkhazia, the situation quickly spiraled out of control. The region played host to some of the most violent atrocities, not only of the Georgian Civil War, but all of the conflicts that erupted amid the collapse of the USSR. Indeed, according to a 1994 US State Department report, the Abkhaz separatist forces committed widespread atrocities against the Georgian civilian population. In one instance, it was reported that approximately 400 Georgian families in Ochemchiri were killed during the Abkhaz offensive on the city. Many were then taken hostage in a soccer stadium and executed, resulting in 235 civilian deaths. In another instance, Abkhaz forces are said to have violated a ceasefire agreement in Gagra in September 1992 by taking around 1,500 Georgians hostage. The next morning, at least 50 civilians were found hanging from electricity poles. On the Abkhaz side, the claim that on December 14, 1992, a Russian Mi-8 helicopter evacuating Abkhaz civilians from the resort of Pisunda was intentionally shot down by Georgian forces, resulting in the deaths of 87 people, the majority being women and children. Irrespective of the verifiability of accounts from either side, what is inarguable is that the horrific crimes were committed by both sides throughout the war, and that thousands, perhaps as many as 200,000, were forced to leave their homes as a result. As summarized by the academic Spencer Meredith, the costs of the initial fighting were enormous. Hundreds of thousands of Georgians were either forcibly expelled or fled after suffering horrendous violence at the hands of the separatists. The Abkhaz cite similar experiences from the Georgians, with stories of people being burned alive, systemic rape and dismemberment, and mass murder. Neither side can claim the moral high ground, nor has either side fully acknowledged its wrongdoing. In any case, Moscow was quick to get involved, and the extent of its influence on the outcome of the conflict continues to be deeply controversial to this day. A report published by the International Committee of the Red Cross explains that, quote, although Russia initially proclaimed neutrality in the conflict, President Boris Yeltsin argued that Russia should have a special role as a guarantor of peace and stability in what it termed its near abroad. While it is unclear if Moscow was trying to preserve stability in the region or manipulate the conflict to establish more control over its neighbors. Russian forces clearly contributed to the intensity of the fighting. Russia's first major contribution was a ceasefire brokered in Moscow on September 3, 1992, but this did not hold. With the war raging on by May 20, 1993, another ceasefire was brokered by Moscow, but fighting resumed in June. By the end of July, the Abkhaz forces, now backed by the Russian Air Force and a motley crew of fighters from the North Caucasus, effectively had Sukhumi under siege, prompting the signature of yet another ceasefire by Russian, Georgian, and Abkhaz representatives in Sochi on July 27th. In this ceasefire, it was agreed that Georgian troops should be withdrawn from Abkhazia by August 16th. Retreating Georgian troops were simultaneously being attacked by Sviatists in Mingrelia, however, making this withdrawal almost impossible. This only incentivized the Abkhaz separatists further, and by September 19th, they were advancing into Sukhumi from 3 different directions. By September 27th, Sukhumi finally fell to the Abkhazians. Yeltsin managed to convince Ardzinba to grant Shevardnadze safe evacuation from Abkhazia, but he could not leave by air, and as such, his private plane continues to sit on the tarmac of the abandoned Sukhumi airport to this day. The fall of Sukhumi saw the exodus of almost the entirety of Abkhazia's Georgian population, while the intense fighting left 10,000 to 15,000 dead and at least 8,000 wounded. With the fall of Sukhumi in September 1993 then, the Georgian Civil War reached a bloody and dramatic conclusion. Well, almost. What about Gamsakhurdia and the Sviatists? As Georgian troops withdrew from Abkhazia, the Mkhedrioni were temporarily renamed the Georgian Rescue Corps and given the task of quashing the renewed Sviatist uprising in western Georgia. They did so with extreme brutality that prompted criticism from human rights organizations and governments around the world, even those that supported the Shevardnadze government. On October 8, 1993, Shevardnadze announced that Georgia would join the Commonwealth of Independent States, significantly bolstering the Georgian state's capacity to defend itself. In January 1994, Gamsakhurdia then passed away in Mingrelia, which effectively ended what remained of his movement. By the time Georgia signed a treaty of friendship and cooperation with Russia in February 1994, over 50% of Georgia's workforce was unemployed, 80% of its industry was idle, inflation had reached 2,000%, and salaries averaged around $2 per month. Georgia was left in ruins. As most of our viewers will know, despite the war between Georgia and Russia in 2008, little has changed since the conflicts in Abkhazia and South Ossetia were frozen at the end of 1993, though both territories now rely almost entirely on Russia for support. Georgia was of course not unique in the problem it faced after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but there were a number of factors endogenous to Georgia which did make such issues perhaps more irreconcilable. If we were to take the Tajik Civil War as a point of comparison, in our videos on that topic, we explained how warlords from the various ethnic factions there were eventually able to coalesce around mutual economic interests and form a functional, albeit deeply corrupt, state and government. Yet in Georgia, this was not possible. Why? Well, in Tajikistan and Central Asia, policies like Korenizatsiya effectively aimed to create national identities from scratch. In Georgia and the Caucasus, more broadly, however, such policies instead served as a divide and rule tactic which only intensified the pre-Soviet era divisions. By formalizing the sovereignty of ethnic groups to differing degrees, this meant that there were no real mutual interests to speak of. The desire to hold on to sovereignty would always be greater than the desire to compromise. Fundamentally, all ethnic groups saw themselves as the victims of colonization. For Georgians, this meant freeing themselves from Moscow, but for Abkhazians and Ossetians, this meant freeing themselves from Moscow and Tbilisi. The realities of geopolitical power, however, dictated that no side truly got what they wanted in the end. On balance then, the Georgian Civil War is perhaps best understood not as a single conflict, but 3 separate, albeit interconnected, civil wars. We will close with another quote from Wheatley. Quote, "After the USSR was formally disbanded at the end of December 1991, there was much talk about a new world order of peace and prosperity. In much of the former Soviet Union, however, the end of communism seemed to herald a new world disorder, in which the very notion of the state as a natural form of political organization was called into question. Violent crime, lawlessness, and economic collapse gripped most of the former USSR. Georgia was particularly hit hard. The new state was engulfed by no less than 3 civil wars in the space of as many years. By mid-1993, the dichotomy that is characteristic of most modern civilizations, that between the state on the one hand and society on the other, had more or less completely broken down. One could say that both the state and society had ceased to exist. All that remained were scattered fragments that could be said to belong to both." We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss our future work, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have pressed the bell button, which is considering signing a treaty of cooperation and mutual friendship with those other bell buttons. What could possibly go wrong? We would like to extend a special thanks to Michael Hilliard for his insight and resources on this topic, without which this series would not have been possible. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is the Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of grey and rarely black and white.